join us. So today, welcome to Data Curation in Action, which is a panel with some excellent researchers who are going to be talking to us about data in various different fields. So this, I think, is really important to us in the library world and to researchers in general. As research becomes increasingly data intensive, researchers are having to manage data sets, curate, preserve, basically do things that they really have not had much formal training in doing. But librarians have expertise and training in some of these areas, and so this is a great opportunity for us to collaborate with researchers in some new and exciting ways. And so we do have some researchers here who are going to talk to us about data in their field and what they're doing with data. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tammy Kramer-Sedlick, who is Director of Programs for the UCLA Division of Social Sciences, and she was also Director of Research at the UCLA Center on Everyday Lives of Families. And her research focuses on the relationships between cultural norms and ideologies regarding family, work, childhood, parenting, and morality, and the everyday practices and experiences of families and their individual members. Also joining her is Paul Connor, who's the Digital Projects Director for the Division of Social Sciences. He also manages data for the Center on Everyday Lives of Families, including audio, video, and images. He holds a BA in Cinema and Television from the University of Southern California, and prior to joining the center, he had worked in several positions in entertainment technology. Chris Johansson is an assistant professor in the Department of Classics, as well as associate director of the UCLA Experiential Technology Center, co-director of the Laboratory for Digital Cultural Heritage, and member of the steering committee for the recently inaugurated undergraduate and graduate curriculum in digital humanities. His research applies the tools and techniques of digital humanities and the analytical methodologies of classics to social historical problems. In addition to conducting research on Roman life, he is also interested in developing new methods of historical visualization and knowledge representation. And finally, Carly Strasser is project manager for data curation for Excel, or DCXL, a program of the California Digital Library's UC Curation Center, or UC3. The goal of the DCXL project is to create an open source add-in for Excel that will facilitate data sharing, management, and archiving for scientific researchers. Prior to joining CDL, she was a postdoctoral associate at Data One, a cyber infrastructure for environmental and ecological data, and she holds a PhD in biological oceanography from MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and has conducted research in population modeling of sea life. So we have a great panel of varied researchers from all different backgrounds. I'm very pleased to have them joining us today. I'd also like to thank Jen Weintraub, who participated in planning this event. And with that, we'll get started. So each of the panelists is going to give a brief introduction to the kind of research and data that they're working with, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I'll let you guys begin.
I'm very happy to be here, and I will start quickly by telling you a little bit about the research that we have conducted at the Center on Everyday Life and Families, and let Paul take over when we get to technical. So we were founded by the Sloan Foundation to address these two following questions. How do parents who work manage workplace demands, raising a family and running a household? And what are the pressures and demands on working parents? To that end, we put together a team of interdisciplinary scholars from, as you can see, mostly from the social sciences, but also from psychology. And we also had two sister centers, one in Sweden and one in Italy, that conducted, duplicated our methodology almost completely, but on a much smaller scale. The study was ethnographic in nature. It had, for that reason, we didn't have many families to participate in the study, and when I'll start telling you about the methodology, you'll see that it was quite time consuming. So there were 32 families in our study. They had consisted of two parents. The parents didn't have to be biological parents, but two adults who lived in the home and acted as parents to 2 or 3 children, at least one of them between the ages of 8 and 10. They had to be homeowners, but depended on their income to pay mortgage. And that was our attempt to define middle class, which was one of our mandates, to study dual earner families from middle class families. At the heart of our study was the video recording of everyday family life. We followed with 2 cameras parents from the moment the family woke up till the moment the children went to sleep. We did not film inside the in the workplace or in the schools, but anywhere around. So we follow the families to their activities or in the car when they drop off the kids, picked up the kids, went to soccer practice, went to the supermarket, to the doctor's appointment. And so our data included 2 full weekdays and a weekend, so Saturday and a Sunday. On average, we accumulated 50 hours of video recording per family. In essence, each camera focused on a parent. When one parent was not around, then they focused on a target child, that child that was between 8 and 10 years old. In addition, we wanted to know how homes as living spaces facilitate certain type of family life and activities or hinder, and so for that reason we wanted to know, first of all, what the spaces looked like. So we measured and mapped homes and created this kind of blueprints of home space and in the yard. We also wanted to know how the spaces were used. So while we were in the home filming the families with 2 cameras, remember, there was a third researcher that was walking around and in 10 minutes intervals noted who is where, doing what, using what, and with whom, so that we would get a sense of the kind of activities and interactions that the spaces afford. So for example, and we noted that on a Palm Pilot, and this was and for that is our most quantitative of our data. A lot of it is ethnographic, qualitative. Here's an example of a home space, and here's one parent in the kitchen, a child in the bathroom, and then a parent and a child in the bedroom, and then we could see that they are actually sitting on the floor and reading a book. So all this was noted on the Palm Pilots. Using these maps, we asked parents and children, so every family member, to create their own narrated home tours. We gave them small cameras and tapes, and we asked the small children would be assisted, but we mainly were interested in questions about space, what they called the room, what activities occur in certain rooms, what they liked about certain spaces, what they didn't like about certain spaces. And this could be 10 minutes long or 1 hour long. It depended on the individual, how much they had to tell. It yielded a lot of conversation about heirlooms and about objects and about repair and remodeling and all kinds of conversations about that. What you see here is a mother who films her very messy garage. Also, to understand the use of the home and the material culture of families, middle-class families in LA, we took many digital photos of objects in the home, including even books, close-up, so that we can see the titles. And we did a 360-degree photography of each home space. In addition to all this, we conducted ethnographic interviews about all kinds of topics in their lives, whether it was their schedules, their daily routines, who is in their life, who's helping them, whom they help, friendships, about their educational goals and practices, and we also topic of the health and well-being, focusing from insurance that they get, health insurance that they get for the workplace, to what are practical ways of handling the situation when a child is sick and both parents have to go to work, to finally what they believe makes them a better, healthier parent or a healthy family, or how they define well-being. And we ended this interview with a tour of the pantry and the fridge, where we wanted to see how they talk about food, exercise equipment, and dieting and supplements. Finally, we also interviewed the children about their perspectives of growing up in dual families and about their lives in school and activities. In addition to all this, during the 2 weekdays that we filmed the families, and an additional weekday, we also collected saliva samples from the children that are 8 years and older and from the parents. We collected that there for 3 days, 4 times a day. In saliva we can read the levels of cortisol, nicknamed the stress hormone, which is a hormone that its natural pattern is that it peaks as soon as we wake up and gets down to baseline at the end of the day. And what is interesting is what kind of slope it is. The research on cortisol has shown us that the slope is associated with levels of stress, well-being, and even mortality. And we were interested in knowing that in combination with the fact that we documented them on tape. In addition, We asked them every time they gave a sample of saliva, we asked them to fill out a quick questionnaire that told us about their mood and the event that just occurred. Since they filled out 2 samples, gave 2 samples, they filled out questionnaires twice while at work or at school, we wanted to tap onto whether this was a stressful day at work or at school in terms of work load, as well as in terms of social interaction. And lastly, we also had surveys and questionnaires, including psychological measures. And I'll pass it right to Paul.
Okay, so I'll give you some more details about some of the technical aspects. You can see we had 1,540 hours of video recorded. It was all recorded on mini DV tapes, and 260 hours of audio interviews, 20,000 photos, the tracking observations that Tammy spoke about, and then 1,100 cortisol samples. All of this was stored on a central server. We had, I think, 10 faculty and oftentimes 20 or 30 undergraduate students working in the lab. So everybody could access at the same time.
Postdocs and graduate students.
Postdocs,
Yeah.
graduate students, yeah. The formats that we had, all the video was put into MPEG-1 at first. This study started in 2001, and it was important to us to have a standard format that could be usable for a long time. There were also a few other restrictions I'll get into later. H.263 we used for streaming to the centers in Sweden and Italy. And then later we actually went back and re-encoded some of the tapes into MPEG-4, and then some of the other ones that we used a lot actually into an uncompressed DV stream, basically exactly what's on the tape. All of our audio is uncompressed. Photos are pretty much the JPEG camera originals. RAW wasn't available at the time. And then we reduced some of the JPEGs in order to make the databases go faster that incorporate them. And then QuickTime VR files. Regular sort of assortment of documents: Word, plain text, Excel, FileMaker Pro, Access, Visio was what we used for the floor plans of all the houses, Keynote, PowerPoint, most of the normal file formats you might see. In creating the archive, we first a tape would come in. We had 1,800 tapes total that would come in. They were duplicated at the same time as they were being coded or digitized into MPEG-1 format, all real-time process. Because of the amount of tapes that we were getting in, it had to be quick. We had 2 stations to do this, so that part's very important. Immediately uploaded to the server. Certain codes were put in for, there was a naming convention, it's not on here, but there was a naming convention that we set up when we went out. So the family number, each family was assigned a number, the date that they were being filmed on, and then the camera. Since we had 4 cameras total, oftentimes we had two families going at the same time, and each family got 2 cameras. So one family would get camera A and B, the other family would get C and D, and we kept track of that as well in the naming convention. Just in case problems came up. Luckily, we actually didn't run into many problems with cameras, but it also lets you know down the line what angle you're coming at a scene from. Very helpful, and definitely do that before going out. Those were uploaded to the server. One of the first steps was activity logs for the tapes. So a transcriber, as we call them, would go through a tape and look for these specific things. You see food, play, recreation, exercise, just to give a very quick overview of what's happening on the tape. It was sort of a very rough coding of it, so that researchers could get right into the data. A file came in, or a tape came in a couple days later, they'd have this report and be able to start looking at it if it seemed like it was interesting to them. The next process takes quite a bit longer, the transcribing of all of the data. And we had a customized software called vPrism, which actually runs inside of 4D server. I don't know if anybody's heard that. It's sort of an application development environment. There was a product for transcribing. We sort of customized it for our needs and added a coding system to it. And basically what that does is it syncs the video that we had, and you can see the little example of it playing there. It syncs the video with what somebody types in for transcription. Now it's very common. It was a little less common then. We have over 1 million utterances. Think of that as sentences or every time that somebody spoke. The coding section, we were looking for specific things. So one of the things that was coded was the person who was in the shot and the location that they were in at the time. So this is actually sort of like the tracking that we did, but fine-grained to basically frame accurate. We developed this. So you can see a little bit of the interface there. We had some pre-coded things that people were looking for. They do an in point and out point. That was effectively the code. There were 271,000 codes at the end. They're all searchable. You can search by code, so you can search if you wanted to find when mother and son are in the kitchen and it's a weekend day. You can find that on here, and it'll bring up, yeah. Some of the searches take a little while, but it'll bring up the clips of those instances. This is not what I described, but this is family 5, one of the children, and they're using the computer. So you can get to those pretty quickly. That allowed one of our researchers, Eliza, to, she looked at actually families' television use using the coding data, looking for, you can see when mom and dad are with kids watching TV. Yeah, some very interesting things came out of that. And interestingly, 12% of the total time that we filmed a family.
Compare dad alone and mom alone.
Yeah. Learn a lot about families, actually. This is just another breakdown. One of our other graduate students, Jeff Good, broke down how much time people spent doing general activities. Yeah. So all of those questionnaires that Tammy was talking about, they've all been scanned and digitized. We kept the original files, the original hard copy files, then also the initial scan, and then they were turned into PDFs, some of which are searchable for the fields. And then, of course, the responses were entered into databases. We used FileMaker mostly, so we had some databases. The picture database is also a FileMaker database, and the images, all 20,000 of them, were also tagged for what's present, so space, food, artwork, school toys. Forget exactly how many things were actually coded for, but it's quite a number. And again, you can go in and search for specific things. So this one is looking for a pet. Well, actually, I don't know what the search was, but it looks like maybe family.
In front yard, maybe.
So anytime you want a picture of the family. And these are separate from the video data. So these aren't just still grabs from the video. These are pictures. So they're a little higher quality. I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about, just very briefly, some of the technical considerations that I looked at when setting up the behind-the-scenes part of this project, which was the ease and the speed of the workflow is huge. The amount of data that was coming in and the speed that we had to turn it around, you really have to be cognizant of how long it takes. Quality was also very important to me. We have linguistics professors who are studying this and grad students who are looking at it, so the quality of the actual audio data and the recordings, so what equipment you use to film these, the data, current use, how the researchers foresaw using the data at that time, but then also potential future uses and future researchers coming in on the project, which it did actually change quite a bit, and lots of things were added later. And then also considerations really for users that you have no idea are even, 10, 20 years down the line, and we really did think about that right off the bat. And so that was one of the considerations in making the videos into like MPEG-1 files. Wow, now that wouldn't be my choice today, but at the time that was really the best option available, and those movies will be playable for another 100 years. players really, and if you had to, you could actually write your own player. So if a researcher was very desperate to get at those, they could. But we also made sure we kept the analog copies as well. So we have all of those. So it just, there are things to keep in mind for that, which actually I think is kind of your guys' specialty. So that's it.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll try to do this live, which means something won't work. I'm prepared to deal with that too. So my focus is on, really in brief, trying to bring together a visual study of ephemeral kinds of activities set in the ancient world, working within reconstructed spaces of places that we can no longer access in any way, shape, or form. So this involves looking at a variety of data and integrating a variety of data to try to reduce the total complexity in order to do an analysis. And I wanted to show you two projects just to give you an idea of the sorts of data we're working with. And I'll end with a kind of call for the things that we really need help with. And so all of our projects, reconstruction projects set in the ancient world, require connecting to the real world in some way. So this involves really merging different kinds of mapping data together. So I'm showing you the HyperCities platform. This is what we're using to organize our data. This is a system built on Google Maps and Google Earth that uses geographic coordinates as the glue to bring everything together. And this is really the key bit of interoperable data that I'm working with, the geographic coordinate system. So in each case, we've got just a historiographical survey here right now of maps at the site of Magnesia on the Meander. This is a Hellenistic Roman site from the 3rd century BCE up till 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE. This little collection of maps is part of a broader endeavor to try to bring together all of the site plans of the area, including survey work on site. Let's see if I can bring this in. 2007, let's say, including survey work on site, looking at proposed housing locations, for example, or more detailed focus areas. A recent map made, if I can bring it up, of say the current survey work on site. And I'll show you this by integrating it together with a collection. So we have this map base layer to build on. And what we're trying to do is tell space-based stories using this. So to tell the story of the site and to adapt archaeological site reports into a space-based narrative. So here, a kind of introduction to the site that moves us into a series of site reports telling us what happened in, say, 2009 according to the Turkish narrative model for sites. So here, just take one example and we'll see if it works. We'll integrate in some 3D models outlining where we are in the area on the site, accompanied by a description of what was happening during the dig. So here we can drop in. You can see a crude 3D model really mapping out the first location of excavation. We have images along the side. We have text, free-form text right now, working along with it. You'll see our stadium is embedded in the ground here. Function of Google Earth in its terrain for the moment, so we'll just live with it. And we're wrapping in under the ground here this collection of imagery showing the kind of hypothetical modes surrounding the internal stadium area. And back out here, the model theoretically showing us where we are then on the site. I can show you a different example moving back. I'm going to drop out here. Drop over to another area of the site surrounding the Temple of Artemis. This area, the same kind of process, integrating in simple maps, plans showing up actually on the grid here. This is an ongoing project, so whatever you see is pretty much what we have at the moment. A project to be completed in the next 6 months, actually. So just walking through simple points, lines, and polygons. You can imagine overlays of excavation data here. This is a very simple attempt to kind of document an archaeological site, bringing together geo-based argument on one side, simple points, lines, polygons, maps on the other. This connects to a slightly different approach, and that here I wanted to show you. Building on this same sort of data, this typesetted in ancient Rome, using the same geographic core. The goal of this project, listed as Humanities Virtual World Consortium, if we're on a larger, higher resolution screen, you'd see a little more, attempts to bring together a 3D reconstruction of the Roman Forum at different points in time, putting it into a networked virtual world experience, a peer-to-peer experience, where you're able to walk through the site with others and investigate an argument that's running along the side. So here we're actually running a server right now on this machine that any of you who have a computer, you could log in if you have a decent graphics card, just follow the link to phase 3, and you may pop in. We'll see if someone is able to do it. The idea here is that there's a geographic coordinate system underlying us that lets us feed in the same kinds of narratives you were seeing along the side in the Hypercities platform inside of this environment. Now we're going to fall on top of houses and whatnot because this is just a simple little exemplary narrative. And let's see if I can fly around a little. You can get an idea of the content we're working with. This is a mixture of really semi-hard science and pure hypothetical. These are all schematic models really meant to look at built form of the city, to allow us to talk about motion through the city and also to really study social phenomena taking place inside of the city. The key component here, I'll move us into the forum proper here, is that we're integrating imagery both inside of these models, which means we're building up a collection of images, a collection of source maps in our workflow, a collection of 3D digital objects, all sitting on, right now, local servers, and we're meshing them together into an output form that then is also reaching out and loading up a different set of curated, built for consumption models, this 3D content, coupled with collections of feeds of KML data that have text and image and standard HTML inside of it. So this collection of data is what we're trying to manage in some way. And we've got a variety of projects that are working with the same kind of methodology and the same kind of workflow. Here you can see one image of the entrance of a funeral procession inside of the Roman Forum juxtaposed with this 3D version. The idea here, by the way, that one can walk a scholar, a reader, through the same kind of argument that you have in your head and ensure that you have a refutable model in front of you. I'm showing you what I'm seeing, or at least what I'm proposing to see. You can critique the same one, walk through the same space, and we can, in the next phase of this project, what we're developing now, is try to document that path to mark up what you're seeing to create another KML layer. So these are layers of geographic data that can be loaded up in Google Earth, Google Maps, etc. To have layered paths through these 3D worlds that represent, say, a scholarly critique of the current information, or even a live tour on site today. Since we're using the same geographic coordinates that translate to the real world, it really is this interoperable soup. But the key is trying to find the right kind of content management system to handle all of this, and the right kind of system to actually file it away somewhere to have versions that are really accessible and persistent. All of this is a real problem. Our answer is really to all sorts of future preservation, the locks method. Lots of copies keep things safe, and that's really it. We don't have a good data plan. We've worked with people on various kinds of data plan models, but really this is the task, at least as I see, one major task that the library can take on, which is trying to help to work with these projects on the back end and giving an infrastructure that can really persist and one we can work with. And so I thought I'd just give this as the example in action and let the question and answer period actually focus on some details if you want to address them. And then I can turn it over to the next speaker.
unlike speakers who've spoken, I wasn't really all that excited about what I was working on when I was doing science, so I'm not going to spend very long on that part, which leaves me more time to do the discussion section. So I'm Carly, I'm from the California Digital Library, which if you're not aware is the UC Office of the President. We are kind of coordinating digital things for all 10 of the UC campuses is basically what California Digital Library does. And I'm there by way of marine science. So I did my PhD in biological oceanography at Woods Hole through MIT, and I worked on the soft shell clam. So I did a lot of field collections, and I did a lot of going out and getting extremely muddy. And my questions were centered around Cape Cod, which is right in the middle there. So what I was interested in is how the populations were connected. So if you look at all the different populations of clams throughout that area, how they move between these different populations. So it's just like migration in humans. Clams do it, they just don't do it when they're adults, as you probably know if you've ever gone digging for clams. So this is me out in one of the sites, getting really muddy. All those little dots are snails. This is a particularly muddy spot, and it was also really good for collecting clams. And so, just to give you, in case it's been a while since science, clams spawn their gametes into the water, and that's when they're mobile. So they have the gametes that turn into eggs, that turn into larvae, and the larvae swim around, maybe go to different sites, maybe go 1,000 miles away, maybe go 5 miles away. And then eventually, after they get heavier, they settle down, and then they become adult clams. So I was really interested in trying to tie together these different populations using that top row there when they're in the water column. And the long story short of it is I tried a lot of stuff and none of it worked. But it exposed me to a lot of different kinds of data, which was really great for now. So I did a lot of work with shell chemistry. So this is a larval clam shell. It's only a couple of millimeters big, and each one of those little squares on it is we ablated the shell away. So we used a laser to ablate the shell away and then read it in a fancy mass spectrometer there on the right. And the results of this would be that we got giant spreadsheets, hideous giant spreadsheets of data that you would then have to clean up and go through and process and average and try and do something with. So that was trial 1, which I wrote a paper saying it doesn't work. And then trial 2 is genetics, and so for the genetics work, it was primarily sequencing. So I collected a lot of clams, I sequenced their tissues. This is not one of my gels, but this is a sequencing gel representing DNA strands from different organisms. And the molecule up in the top is the molecule that I sequenced, so it's the cytochrome oxidase gene. And from that information, I used a similar kind of, again, I'm asking that same question, how connected are these populations? And so all these little pie charts are showing you how related each of those clam populations are. And you can see that there's a purple gene that everybody's got, and then there's a little bit of variability here and there. And if you're not seeing a pattern, it's because there really wasn't one. So that was also not super useful, but the kinds of data that you can imagine are a lot of character strings. So A's, T's, C's, and G's in a row that you can upload to something like GenBank at the end of your project. So my third attempt used math. So the basic concept is clams reproduce, they die, and they disperse. And so each one of those little dots on the map has clams coming and going depending on these things here. And so I can estimate clam population size using this very simple addition in math. So this is the actual schematic of the patches that I was working with. And this is the equations that I was using, and we're not even going to go there. I did a better job with the map, which I got really excited about. And so then I did a postdoc on the North Atlantic right whale using math. And so the right whale, sorry for the nasty pictures, but the right whale is a highly endangered species. It gets caught up in fishing gear. The one on the right has a rope that it's trailing, and it gets hit by boats. And so that's all propeller damage on this whale here. And so I used math to answer questions like how many are left, is the population growing or declining, and is conservation working? And so I never played with whales. I only saw spreadsheets with data about whales, but it was still a really fun project, and I thought, okay, maybe I can do science. I liked this. So then I went to Canada, and I did a postdoc there with copepods. So this little guy in the middle is like a really tiny little crustacean that lives in the rivers and estuaries off the coast of Vancouver. and I'm here collecting some, which then I grew in the lab, which is there on the right. And I was basically doing all of this to parameterize yet another math model. So more nasty math, but the data up in the top there that's just a snapshot of some of my MATLAB files. So you can imagine that you get simulations out of mathematical data, you get the actual equations that you're using, you have the parameters that you're using to describe parameterize the model and actually get the results out. So these are all interesting pieces of data that people don't really know how to deal with when you start talking about data management plans. So after Canada, I threw in the towel and took a postdoc with Data One, which is that top organization up there, and then now have since moved to California Digital Library. And so my current job, although the Excel add-in thing is definitely a part of it, it's kind of what pays my salary, I spend a lot of time going and talking to scientists about how they manage their data. And so scientists are kind of snobby and they want to make sure that you're on the same playing field with them. So sometimes they're not as open and trusting of, say, a librarian or a computer developer. So I have to, speak their language and get on their level, and then they'll listen to me a little bit better, not always better, but. So basically I describe my position as standing between librarians, computer developers, and IT guys, and scientists, and trying to kind of help facilitate the communication between those groups, which is, it turns out really important since scientists are generating tons of data, and they have no idea what to do with it. They're not trained in information science, they don't know what to do with archives, they don't know what the word metadata means. It's really a no man's land out there for scientists. So I really like what I do. It's just very not related to science anymore, but I guess I'm here representing the science population in general, which I'm happy to do. I feel like I can probably do that all right. So that's it.
Thank you.
We are the last people in this room, so we can stay a little longer if we.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know some of our panelists have to leave, but we'll do what we can. Thanks while you're still here. So I do have a few questions for the panel before we open it up to the audience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sharing of data in your respective fields. I think part of the reason why various funders have encouraged people to think about data management plans is that you're all generating such valuable data and they would like to see that shared with others. So what is the attitude towards sharing in your field? Would you or have you shared data with other researchers in your field, and why or why not? So we can start at the end and work our way across.
Generally, if I identify myself, it's with anthropology. In anthropology, there's typically no data sharing, and part of it also has to do with confidentiality of participants. At least in our case, it definitely is the case. The only people that we have shared the data with are our colleagues in Italy and in Sweden, where we collaborated and worked on projects together. So, but we are, and we feel that would remain true to protect our families' confidentiality for a long time. However, we do think that because we documented everyday life in the turn of the millennium, we think that there's historical value to this data, and so there is a long-term sharing that we definitely think is very valuable. We don't know yet, and I contacted the IRB, we don't know yet when this data can become historical data, when confidentiality does not hold anymore. We don't know yet how to treat it, but it's clear that is something that is in store.
All right. Since I come from classics and what I'm doing, lurking below the hood, is a merger of text and archaeology, it's sort of interesting because on the one hand, in the world of classics, almost all of our raw material is shared by everyone. That is the text of Virgil, not necessarily the most recent text, the copyrighted text, but at least the bulk of the material that most of us are working with, some version is shared and passed around, and we often are talking about the same data. At the same time, the archaeological community within classics is much more protective of its data, because once you lay claim to a site, this is really your livelihood for 20 or 30 years. And there are other reasons why you may not want to share your data in certain places. You don't want someone to know precisely where it is you're working. So this moves into anthropology, obviously, in some ways. So there's really a mix, but at the same time, because of this, I think, shared textual basis, within this ancient historical mode, there's a lot of openness towards trying to circulate pre-publication, trying to look at different kinds of open journal distribution, and trying to focus on sharing data in different ways. So the 3D projects and the mapping projects really are almost all built on platforms that are moving around open data under the hood and accessible data. There's almost always a web service of some sort giving you access to the bits that you might want. But at the same time, there's still a mixture of some willing to share, others not, for all of the reasons that you might imagine, related more to kind of practical promotion and the protection of ideas more than anything else, because sometimes you simply can't share your new plan of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus because you're writing your book on it, and there you go.
That's a good lead in to me, which is that scientists don't like to share because they're very worried about their intellectual property, and what if, they think of their data sets as their babies, and they're going to squeeze every last drop of paper publications out of that data set. And so there's a lot of hesitance to share. There's not a lot of belief that they should share. There's no incentive to share. There's no structure in the tenure process to make them feel like they should devote the time and energy that it takes to actually prepare your data to make it available to other people. And so as a result, it's pretty abysmal in the sciences on average. There's definitely some groups that are better than others. It's changing because the National Science Foundation has started mandating data management plans, so I think that'll go a long way towards pushing people in that direction. In terms of personal data sharing, I'm horrible. I have all these data from my graduate work, and the only thing that I've shared publicly is the genetic data, because that's the culture of genetic data. They've always shared their data. I didn't share it at first because it was just a little one-off project that I did, and I got an email about 2 years later from someone that said, hey, I was looking for your data in GenBank and I couldn't find it. And I said, oh yeah, I never got around to that. Here's the files, like you can just have them. And they said, this is so embarrassing, by the way, that I'm now one of these like advocates for data sharing, and I did this. But anyway, I was like, oh yeah, I never got around to that. And he said, he shamed me in an email. He said, this is what our group does. And I know you're not a geneticist, and I know that this was a one-off project for you, but if you're gonna play in the genetics world, you have to share your data. So I took the time and energy, and I did it, and I happily sent him an email saying, tail between my legs, I finally did it, here's the link, I'm really sorry. And I mean, that was the kick in the pants I needed. So you can't underestimate the power of sociocultural influence in data sharing, I think. I kind of wish somebody would do that to make me share all the rest of my data, which I haven't done yet. So.
Thank you. So some of you kind of alluded to this when you were talking a little bit about your data, but could you talk about what you see as the major challenges to data curation and management, either with your particular data or in your field in general?
Well, one of the things is really, I think that everybody would agree, is to make it accessible over time, because of the absolute aspect of that, starting actually from analog data that has not been digitized. So one thing is to actually make that available somewhat in a digital form, and then later on that this digital form will remain accessible. I think this is true of all data and data sets. So
Yeah, a big challenge I see is getting things into the right formats, or what is the right format that will survive, for 30 or 40 years. And the fact is that lots of those,
only 30 or 40?
or hundreds, thousands.
You're yourself short here.
Thousands, yeah. But yeah, exactly. I mean that, and clearly they're going to change over time. I mean, they changed while we were doing our project, and I knew that they would do that, so there was always sort of the idea that we would go back. And then there's also things that happen, like on ours, when we started, hard drives were incredibly expensive for the amount of space that we were using. If we did that today, it would be a joke. I mean, I could almost put it on a phone, the data. Not quite. It's still quite a bit, but almost. You could do it for quite a bit less. So things like that are changing all the time, and it's sort of coming up with plans for when that change ultimately happens. Will you be able to change this data or move this data into something like that? And what can you do to make the highest probability that you'll be able to do that. That's a big challenge.
I just want to add something related to that, that earlier on, even in early ethnographic projects, because of the expense, or because of the fact that it was analog data much more difficult to even collect, it seemed there was the data was smaller. Simply today, it's clear that you can just collect a lot more data. And so it's much harder to mine it, to code it, and then to store it and to do things with it. So.
Yeah, I mean, building off of that, the amount of data is a real problem. I mean, in fact, on archaeological sites, the real trick is trying to determine what not to gather, because we're at this critical moment where you want to collect everything, but, you know, digital photographs from 1999 in a fairly low resolution really aren't that useful in the grand scheme of things in some ways. You know, it's like you really have to pick and choose. We've kind of moved from 1950s data gathering to 2,400 without bridging that gap to try to find the sweet spot. But actually for me, the two most important things I think are the most important obstacles really are just sort of simple ones. Copyright as one, just you have a hard time sharing everything because of copyright. And if you start talking about copyright, then you sort of have to shut down a lot of the discussion because there's always something that sort of interferes, and it's changing, I suppose, over time. But the second, I think, is even more important, and that is that even though right now, technologically, we really could handle a lot of the data being produced in ancient history, for example, in archaeology and classics, it's not what's really rewarded within the academic career structure. So, you know, it's still a monograph culture. It's not a kind of database building culture. So, you know, if this were happening in 1901 in Germany with the technology that we have now, we would have all sorts of amazing databases being built up right away that really were interoperable, that were reaching out in really interesting ways. But that kind of methodology in the world of classics isn't elevated or prized at the moment. It's really something you do as a service as opposed to what you do with the research in particular. And it really is holding things back when it comes to kind of manipulating and working with this data on a large scale. People want to do it, and they're sort of doing it despite the limitations, but that's a major one.
Yeah, those are all definitely data governance is challenging in general, just figuring out how to deal with intellectual property. And then in science, it's like, oh, well, facts aren't copyrightable, so your individual data points aren't copyrightable, but your data set is copyrightable, and then the database can be, but not the data in the, yeah, it just gets really messy. And I think that scares away a lot of scientists. And I think the other big challenge is that scientists like to kind of keep doing what they're doing. They're pretty sure that the way that they're doing things is right. And so like having them learn a new software or attend a seminar in data management or write a data management plan, it's like, ugh, throw their hands up in the air. One more thing I have to learn how to do. I just want to do my research, and you know, you're making me do these things that I have no interest in. Again, because the incentives aren't there. So I think that it's a combination of incentive structures and a lack of education and appreciation for the importance of data curation in science.
So I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the audience. Oh, lots of questions.
I have a question about social science, and I wonder if there's someone in the audience who might know that. In 1985, National Academy Press published Sharing Research Data, which was all trying to encourage social scientists to share their data sets after they had reasonable time for publication and so forth. And not being in social science, I don't know what's happened to that, I don't know what's gone on in the field of social science, but since they had that early document, I wonder if there's something that might be different in that area.
I can say that social science in general does a better job of sharing than the natural sciences or the earth sciences, and they have been for a while. You have ICPSR and you have databases that exist, and I don't know that it's necessarily universal. Everyone does it, but it's just that the culture is there that you need to contribute your data to the databases. But you guys might know more about.
Yeah, is that something that you guys can speak to
Yeah.
at all? Or?
I don't know in general about the social sciences.
I guess a spin-off on the sharing question, potentially you might want to use other people's data that's already been collected. What would you need to know about it in order to know that, yes, I want to pursue getting that before I consider doing my own?
Yeah,
everything. You want to know
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
you possibly
Yeah,
can
everything.
about the
That's-
data set.
That's actually interesting. I mean, in our data before the center closed, we actually went back and did a pass. When you're doing a project, the main purpose is for the people who are using it at that time. They're writing papers or writing other grants. Grad students are applying for jobs elsewhere. I mean, everybody's using the data for an immediate purpose, and so they sort of end up kind of morphing a little bit to those purposes, and just in terms of like how they're organized. So we actually went back right at the end, like maybe the last month or two, we spent trying to even just write up things about this is what this data was, this was how it was used by this person, changing, we converted certain files into other files that just so we'd have 3 different versions of the same data maybe, so that, again, 50, 100, 1,000 years from now, one of those hopefully somebody can do something with. But then also, you have to have that description there of what it is, all that, even the methodology of how it was collected, things like that, so that if a researcher did ever get it, those are questions that they would ask. You want to know everything you possibly can, and I think a lot of times that's left out.
And, yeah, I would also add that I worked at a synthesis center for a while, and they basically bring in data sets that have already existed and try to combine them and answer interesting questions. And so the stories of how those data sets were documented it's kind of alarming to hear what people think of as good documentation. And so, I think that the scientists that have had to try and use that data, they're probably going to document their data better than anybody else on the face of the planet, right? Because they know, they're like, oh yeah, no one's going to have any idea what this code means or what temp means or what, there's just all kinds of things that are hidden in the data that make it potentially really challenging for other people to use. And so the one good thing about that is that I tell scientists when they say, I don't want to share my data because someone's going to scoop me. And I say, you know your data set better than anybody else. There's no way you can document your data set to the point that somebody could generate the same quality publications as you as the data collector. And so that's one way to put a spin on the bad part about having to document things extensively to make sure someone else uses them, is that no matter how well you document it, you'll never be able to replicate your brain on paper, and the way you design the study and how what you remember about that day in the field or whatever. So.
I think we've hit 3 o'clock. I think some of our panelists need to leave.
Yeah.
Are you guys all okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
Well, I'm here.
I can say.
So thank you all for participating.
How they've done it, or trying to combine our sets, and it's so much management in Excel.
Yes.
So given that the California Digital Libraries has this Excel program that they're doing, what are they doing about that issue, or how are they trying to tackle it?
I think that, California Digital Library itself probably isn't really doing much about tackling that, but I think what the data community envisions is that the individual disciplines, it's on the onus of the disciplines to come up with an ontology, and a vocabulary set, and a known data structure, and a metadata standard. And if you have all of those things in place as a discipline, then it's much easier for libraries or data centers to be able to help you kind of integrate your data sets and make sure, they can say, okay, well, we can't accept this data set because it's in this sloppy Excel spreadsheet with no documentation. Whereas, if your community standard is, you need to use this metadata standard and it needs to be a CSV file, and then they can put that constraint on the incoming files, and it'll go a long way towards
I think
that.
one of the biggest problems though is that many field researchers face, in my discipline, I think others too, whatever standards were developed were pre-digital.
Yeah.
So we have people document like age and sex the same exact way, but then once they put it into a digital form, extracting that can take hours.
Yeah.
So you might be able to read it and say, okay, I know where it is, but in a mass, taking 1,000 entries, for example, is where it gets really.
And this is where I really see so much opportunity for the computer nerds nobody in here is a hardcore computer nerd and gets offended by that, but the computer nerds really interfacing with the scientists. And I definitely know some of those guys that are interested and are trying to make science easier for scientists to do, or researchers in general, to make it easier for them to, collect data and efficiently analyze it. But for whatever reason, I see a breakdown in that communication. So it depends very much on the field, but that kind of thing is, you have a friend whose boyfriend is in the computer science department and you chat with him, and that's where like small little pilot projects get started that NSF wants to pay for. NSF wants people to start tightening up their disciplinary standards and making databases and really kind of bringing things into like a nice, cohesive, organized thing. And it's just that you have to have the scientists and the computer guys working together. And it doesn't seem like that happens enough, but I strongly encourage you to go hang out with some guys in computer
I've already
development.
developed a database
Mhm.
or a software form that works on Android-based
Mhm.
system, tablet phones,
Oh,
for
perfect.
this purpose, and then I have it uploaded to Google server.
Oh, yeah. That's
So,
great. So you're like,
I'm already working.
maybe
on that.
you should be,
Maybe I should.
we just like created what you're gonna do with your academic
I just
career.
need to convince everyone else to do it. Game.
Yes. So, I have to confess, I'm the university archivist, and one of my areas is faculty papers and research. And up until now, I've been working primarily with analog, but of course, and I do across the disciplines. So right now I'm working with Leon Knoppoff, and who did earthquake studies, and earthquake guys were all talking to each other, and in fact reaching out to the Russians to try to standardize the measurement of earthquakes in the 60s. And then you discover that the economists have the pre-publication website where they park all of their pre-publication papers up on the economic, and everybody's sharing them and commenting on that stuff. And so as I'm working discipline through discipline, and then I just finished with sociology, and as I uncover jazz drives and all this stuff, and we don't know what's on it, and I know to look for code books, and so I'm still primarily in a pre-computer, depending on the discipline, and analog environment, but I'm keeping in mind the potential use from a historical perspective, or to keep researchers from reinventing the wheel in terms of the descriptions. And I'm thinking about, you can't keep track of everything going on at UCLA. I have no idea about the Center for Everyday Jobs. You're now no longer in business?
Yeah, well, the center formally closed in 2010, but I'm still around, Tammy's still around,
so-
the data's still there, a number of the professors, yeah.
On whose server?
Ours.
Okay.
Yeah.
And somebody's paying for that right now?
Yeah.
And of course, okay. So there's lots of interactions, but so that was the setup. I'm thinking, let's co-opt the researchers at the point that they're going through the training and the research methodology courses. And I guess in science, a lot of the guys, people get their training with their mentor. We know that. And so you're kind of dependent upon what your mentor and how they approach it. And to get that person to change how their routines are is very difficult. But it seems to me other disciplines can much more easily insert the desire. We can indoctrinate the next generation. No, I'm talking seriously here. To start thinking about that whole concept of data sharing.
Yeah, no, this, it's something that CDL is heavily involved in, and Data One both, is developing educational materials, and the goals of those materials is basically providing something that a first-year graduate student professor can incorporate into their course. So if there's a research methodology class, they can take these PowerPoints and talk about it with their students. And then, basically there's a lot of resources being developed, but I think that the libraries are really going to be the ones to push to get this information into those courses, because like you said, a lot of the old guard is not really interested in this stuff. And in science, I think there are enough opportunities in that first year of graduate school that you could get in there, and you could make this happen, because if you leave it up to the advisors, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, actually just a little something on that. We were housed in the anthropology department, and the methods that we used for this study have definitely permeated into the rest of the department. I mean, partly just we were a very large center there, and the number of faculty that were involved in our center, but we have done sort of methodologies classes where we came in. They're always anthropological methods courses.
Yeah, right. You guys are one of the better ones, too.
Right, yeah, for sure. And so we have definitely passed it on, lessons that we learned from this project. And you see it also in the grad students going on and doing much more, video recording research and not having some of the problems that they maybe would have. So it does percolate.
We take one final question.
I'm thinking from the standpoint of the librarian side, and kind of have a two-pronged, but it's a related question, is what do you see as, in general, the role that a librarian can play in bringing this information about data management to the various researchers? But in order to be effective at doing that, what does a librarian need to know? In general.
So my, the director of California Digital Library, Lane, she just yesterday interviewed me because she's going to be serving on a panel that is asking those two questions at Berkeley in a couple of weeks.
Oh,
and so,
I heard about that.
yeah, so I think it's going to be really good, but I don't get to go because I'm out of town, but whatever. Anyway, so what Lane and I chatted about was that I think that libraries can play such a huge role in this, and what they need in terms of background and education is just what they already have, being information science specialists, and then maybe doing an hour a week of little web hunting and finding out what their faculty are up to and what their websites look like and what the databases are in that community and what the software programs are. Because if you sit down with a researcher and you're going to help them manage their data and they say, oh, well, I have all these scripts that I run in R, and you have to say what's R, and 80% of ecologists use R, and so if you're sitting down with an ecologist and saying what's R, you're going to lose a lot of street cred, and unfortunately that's important for some of these scientists. So I think that's critical. And in terms of what role I think the libraries can play, I mean, it's such an exciting time to be, not to be cheesy, but it's such an exciting time to be part of libraries, right? Like, this is the information age, and I mean, librarians are information professionals. It's like perfect. It's like a match made in heaven, as long as they're willing to really get out there. I think that they need to make themselves known. They need to make sure everybody is aware of their skill set and, make themselves indisposable, which they can do, at least for research scientists, because a lot of research scientists, like I said, are not trained in this stuff, and they don't know about metadata, and they don't know about archiving, and they don't know about file formats. And if you can show them that you can make their everyday lives easier, it'll, you will be completely indispensable in the academic community. So.
It's a tricky question. I mean, you have to learn a lot about what the particular researcher is doing and some of their methodologies. I mean, I think that a number of things that we did, especially at the time with this project, there weren't other people doing this type of project. And so there's definitely more of an incentive for our center to figure out how to do those things than any librarian, than any other person who has a million other things to do. And so, I think that makes it tricky. So if a library kind of focuses on certain areas and learns those really, really well, then they can be of particular assistance to researchers. But you're going to run into a researcher, who has figured a number of things out, and they're going to say, well, what can you do for me? So there's also, what basic. I mean, there's storage is kind of always an issue. I mean, I guess it's different with different data sets, but definitely how to keep track of it. I mean, that's what I think of as always a strong point for librarians, and if their methods kind of go in with how librarians think about data. And
Lane and I also talked about the fact that it would be really, one of the things that librarians could go a long way towards really interacting with the scientists more is, attending classes or meeting with professors and heads of the labs and talking to the graduate students and just making everybody aware of your existence, which librarians tend to be a little shy, I think, in terms of making sure everybody knows they're out there and they're really smart. And so I didn't know any of my librarians in grad school. I don't know a single one. So maybe if you're ingrained in the community enough, when a group gets together and starts creating a center for family, et cetera, you can be on the ground floor and you can say, hey, let's solve these problems together. I have skills, you have skills, let's combine our skills and come up with a really awesome solution. It's not to say you have to have the same skill set as the scientists, it's just that you have to show that you can contribute to the conversation, which I think is easier to do early than late, I mean.
Well, and not everyone is anthropology. I mean, I'm sure it's
Yeah.
completely
They sound very
Yeah.
fine
disparate
over there,
across all
they're fine.
disciplines.
Well, it's a great place to leave it with a call to action, I think, for librarians to get out there. So thank you all for coming, and thank you again to our panel for participating.